78 missed calls, all from the same man who once looked me in the eyes and told me I wasn't woman enough to build a family. The screen keeps lighting up as if the past itself refuses to rest, but I sit here quietly, letting it ring, because some calls come too late. I remember the way his voice used to fill this house, how his laughter once felt like a promise, and how one sentence ended it all. He said he was leaving to start a new life with someone who could give him what I could not. And that was the day the silence between us became louder than love. I didn't cry that day, not in front of him at least, because I knew that no amount of tears could hold a man who'd already decided to go. Years have passed, and now he wants to talk, but what could he possibly say that would change what he destroyed with one cold goodbye? I look at the phone again and whisper to myself, not out of anger, but out of peace, that sometimes the only answer left to give is silence. Thank you so much for watching and giving me your time. It truly means more than I can say. And before I continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please tell me in the comments below. I always read them with gratitude. My name is Helen, and I live in a quiet corner of Maryland, where the air smells like rain after a storm, and the evenings are soft enough to think in peace. I never imagined I would tell this story, because for many years I thought silence was the only way to survive what happened. But tonight, I feel ready to let it breathe. I met my husband Robert when I was 25, and back then, I believed love could fix anything. He was charming, full of life, the kind of man who could light up a room just by walking in, and when he asked me to marry him, I said yes without a second thought. We built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A small house with white curtains, matching coffee mugs, and laughter that echoed through every corner. But behind the smiles, there were the years of trying, of hoping, of waiting for something that never came. Every month began with hope and ended in tears. Quiet ones I cried into my pillow so he wouldn't hear. We visited doctors, took the tests, prayed, and held hands in waiting rooms where time seemed to stand still. At first, he was patient, or at least he tried to be. But over time, I could see the light fading in his eyes, the disappointment building into something sharper than words. He stopped holding my hand, stopped talking about the future, and started coming home later, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. Still, I kept pretending, because that's what love does when it's desperate to survive. It keeps believing that maybe tomorrow will be different. But love, I learned, cannot heal what someone refuses to share. I began to feel like a shadow in my own home, moving around quietly so I wouldn't remind him of the emptiness between us. And yet, every morning, I still made his coffee, folded his shirts, and told myself that maybe this was just a season. That maybe, just maybe, he still loved me. Looking back now, I realize I was clinging not to him, but to the dream I built around him. The dream of a life that was never meant to last. The day everything changed was so ordinary that I almost didn't notice the difference at first. The sun came through the window just like it always did. The kettle whistled, and the house smelled of toast and coffee. But his silence that morning was heavier than usual, like the calm before something cruel. He didn't look at me as he sat at the table, didn't touch the cup I set in front of him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of warmth, and full of finality. He said, "Helen, we're parting ways. I'm leaving for my mistress and starting a family." Just like that, no hesitation, no remorse, no trace of the man who once promised forever. I remember standing there, frozen, trying to understand how love could dissolve into such coldness. The spoon in my hand trembled, and for a moment I thought maybe I had misheard him. Maybe it was just a cruel dream, but the suitcase by the door told the truth before his words did. I didn't beg him to stay, because I knew begging would only make him feel powerful. And I didn't shout, because pain like that has no sound. It just sits quietly inside you and burns. I wanted to ask if he ever loved me at all, but I already knew the answer. It was there in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way he walked out without turning back. The door closed behind him, and the echo of that sound followed me for years. It became the rhythm of my nights, the memory that visited me in the silence. I stood in that empty kitchen for a long time, the walls too quiet, the clock too loud, and all I could think about was how love can turn into a stranger faster than the heart can understand. I didn't cry until much later, not because I was strong, but because I was too shocked to remember how. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and I whispered to the dark, not asking for him to return, but for the strength to one day feel whole again, because even then, deep inside the ruin, a small part of me still believed that my story wasn't over yet. The days that followed felt like walking through fog. Nothing looked real, and yet everything hurt too deeply to be imagined. I moved through the house like a ghost, folding the clothes he left behind, washing the dishes he never touched, and pretending the silence didn't ache as much as it did. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what happened, because I didn't want pity, and I didn't want to hear the whispers of people who would think I drove him away. At church, they looked at me differently, with that mix of curiosity and judgment that cuts deeper than any knife, and I would smile politely, sit quietly in the back, and leave before anyone had the chance to ask how I was doing. Even the women I once called friends stopped visiting. Maybe they didn't know what to say, or maybe my sadness made them uncomfortable. But either way, I learned what loneliness really was. I spent my evenings sitting by the window, staring at the streetlights, wondering if he was out there laughing with her, building the life he said he wanted. Every part of me wanted to hate him, but hate only made me tired. So instead, I let time do what it does best. I let it pass. The nights were the hardest, because that was when memories came alive. His laughter echoing through the hallways of my mind, the feel of his hand on mine when things were still good, the promises we made when we thought life owed us everything. I realized that sometimes people break you not because they want to, but because they don't know how to love what they can't control. And in his eyes, my inability to have a child became the reason he stopped seeing me as enough. There were moments when I blamed myself, moments when I whispered apologies into the emptiness, as if my body could hear me and somehow make it right. But with every sunrise, I began to see that pain does not define a person, it refines them. And even though I didn't know it yet, the woman I was becoming was stronger than the one he left behind. Time moved slowly after that, as if the world itself had forgotten I was still here. The mornings were quiet, the evenings even quieter. And I filled the hours with small things that made the silence bearable. I cleaned the house, even when it was already spotless, cooked meals I barely ate, and walked through the park pretending I was just out for fresh air and not running from the ache that lived in my chest. At first, I thought healing would come from forgetting, but I learned that forgetting is not healing. It is just a different kind of pain. One morning I looked at the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older, but her eyes carried a calm I hadn't seen before, as if grief had burned away everything fake and left behind something truer. I decided to sell the house. Too many ghosts lived there, too many echoes of what was supposed to be, and when I handed over the keys, I felt something lift, not joy exactly, but release. I moved into a smaller place on the edge of town, where no one knew my story, where I could breathe without the weight of other people's pity. It was there, in that small house with creaky floors and a garden too wild to control, that I began to find pieces of myself I had long forgotten. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping young girls who had no one to guide them, teaching them simple things like how to bake, how to write letters, and how to believe in themselves, even when the world told them they weren't enough. Their laughter began to fill the empty spaces inside me, and for the first time in years, I felt needed again. Not because of what I could give, but because of who I was. Slowly, I began to understand that love is not always meant to come from one person. Sometimes it grows quietly from the places we pour kindness into. Every smile they gave me, every thank you whispered in small voices, stitched something back together inside my heart. And while I still carried the memory of what I lost, I also carried something new. Peace, gentle and patient, like sunlight finally reaching a room that had been dark for far too long. The more time I spent at the community center, the more I began to understand that life has a way of mending what feels unfixable. Just not in the ways we expect. Those young girls who came in shy and unsure slowly started to open up, sharing their fears, their small dreams, and their quiet hopes, and I listened to them the way I once wished someone had listened to me. Each of them carried their own kind of pain, and somehow, in helping them, I found a way to soothe mine. I taught them how to cook simple meals, how to sew a torn sleeve, and how to hold their heads high, no matter what life threw at them. I remember one of them, a quiet girl named Lila, who never said much at first, but always stayed behind to help me clean up after class. One afternoon she handed me a drawing of the two of us, side by side, smiling, and she said softly, "You remind me of what safety feels like." Those words stayed with me longer than she could have known. I hung that drawing on the wall, and every morning when I looked at it, I felt something shift inside me, something that reminded me that even when life denies you one dream, it often hands you another, wrapped in unexpected grace. The center became more than a place to pass time. It became a home made of shared laughter, forgiveness, and second chances. On weekends we would plant flowers outside, and I would tell them, "Each seed you plant is proof that tomorrow still matters," and I meant it with all my heart. Through them, I learned that love doesn't vanish when someone walks away. It simply changes direction and finds new soil to grow in. And slowly, without even realizing it, the woman who once cried herself to sleep had become someone others looked to for comfort, and that, to me, was its own kind of miracle. Years went by, and the seasons began to move gently again, spring bringing lilacs to my window, autumn painting the streets gold, and winter curling around the little house like an old friend. My days became simple and full, teaching at the center, tending to my garden, and writing letters to the girls who had gone on to build lives of their own. Each of them carried a part of my heart with them. And in their words, I could see reflections of the woman I had fought to become. One who learned to live without bitterness. I no longer measured my worth by what I could give a man, or by what my body could not do, but by the warmth I left in others. I found joy in the small things again, like the sound of laughter spilling through an open window, or the smell of freshly baked bread cooling on the counter. Sometimes in the evenings, I would sit outside with a cup of tea and watch the lights of passing cars, feeling thankful that I no longer waited for one to stop at my door. I had finally built a peace no one could take away from me. A quiet kind of happiness that didn't need approval to exist. And just when I thought the past had settled into memory, when the old pain had grown faint like an echo fading in the distance, life decided to remind me that not every door, once closed, stays that way forever. It started with a message, one small notification on my phone that made my breath catch for a moment, a name I hadn't seen in more than a decade. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, it was him. Robert, the man who had once walked out without looking back. His message was short, just 3 words, but they carried the weight of years. He wrote, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond, not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed to. That night, I sat by the window again, the same window I once looked out of in sorrow, and I whispered to myself that sometimes silence is the only answer that speaks the truth. A few days after that message, the phone began to ring, first once, then again, and before long it became a rhythm that filled the evenings. His name glowing across the screen like a ghost I thought I had buried long ago. I would sit quietly and watch it ring, my heart calm, my hands steady, and my mind somewhere between disbelief and understanding. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the silence he once left behind. Each ring carried a story I no longer wished to read, an apology I no longer needed to hear, and a sadness that no longer belonged to me. The first time he left a message, I listened, just once, his voice cracked and low, saying he was sorry, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that everything he ran to had fallen apart. He said the woman he left me for had walked away years ago, taking the life he thought he wanted with her, and that now he had no one. For a moment, I felt something stir inside me, not pity, not love, but a kind of quiet closure I didn't expect to feel. I realized then that forgiveness doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes softly, through understanding that pain loses its power when you stop feeding it. I deleted the message, not in anger, but in peace, and sat by the window again, letting the cool air touch my face as I whispered, "I forgive you, but I will not return to what broke me." From that night on, the calls kept coming, and I kept letting them ring until the sound no longer meant anything at all. It was strange how time had reversed the roles, how the one who once walked away was now the one begging to be heard. I didn't need to see his face to know he was lost. I could hear it in every unanswered ring, in every silence that followed. But I had learned something far more powerful than revenge. I had learned that peace is not found in making someone regret what they did, but in living a life so full that their regret no longer matters. One evening, after days of letting the phone ring into nothing, I sat in my chair and looked around the little home I had built, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A deep, quiet joy that didn't depend on anyone's presence or approval. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the garden. The lamps cast a warm glow across the room. And I thought to myself, this peace is mine. And it cost me everything I once thought I needed. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who waited by the window hoping to be chosen, who measured her worth by the promises someone else made. And I realized she was gone, replaced by someone who had learned how to love herself without permission. For the first time, I could look back at the years with him and see not failure, but a strange kind of freedom. His leaving had broken me, yes, but it had also set me free, to become the woman I was always meant to be. I had grown stronger in the quiet, wiser in the loneliness, and softer in the way that only comes from surviving heartbreak and still choosing kindness. I no longer wished him pain. I no longer wished him anything at all, because wishing means holding on, and I had already let go. That night, I opened an old box from the closet, filled with pieces of my past, letters, photographs, and memories that once had the power to wound me. I looked through them one last time, smiled gently, and then tied the box shut with a ribbon, not as a symbol of bitterness, but as a way of saying goodbye to the life that once was. I placed it back on the shelf, turned off the light, and whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for what I lost, but for everything I had found in the ruins. Sometimes letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It simply means choosing peace over pain. And on that night, I knew deep down that I had finally chosen right. A few weeks later, just as I began to think the past had finally quieted, there came a knock at my door, soft at first, then again, a little more certain, and I knew before I even opened it who stood on the other side. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake, there was only a stillness, the kind that comes when you've already lived through the worst. I opened the door, and there he was, older, thinner, his once confident eyes now dimmed with regret. He held a small bouquet of flowers, the kind he used to bring home when we were newly married, and for a moment it almost felt like time had folded back on itself. But then I saw the weight of his years, the sadness etched into every line on his face, and I knew that what he carried wasn't love, it was remorse. He tried to smile, said my name softly, as if it were something fragile that might break if spoken too loud, and I nodded, stepping aside just enough to let him in, not out of longing, but out of decency. We sat across from each other in the same living room where I had once waited for him to come home all those years ago. But the air between us was different now, it belonged to me. He spoke first, his voice trembling slightly as he began to speak, saying he had made a mistake, that everything he had chased after turned to dust, that the woman he left me for had taken what little he had left and disappeared without a trace. He said he thought about me every day, that he wished he could go back and undo everything, that he had been selfish, foolish, and blind to what real love was. I listened quietly, not interrupting, not nodding, just letting his words drift into the air and fall where they may. When he was done, the silence between us felt heavy, but not painful. More like the closing of a book whose ending you already knew. I looked at him and said, "You left looking for something you thought would complete you. But I stayed and found everything you never saw." His eyes filled with tears, and I could see the weight of regret in them, the kind that no apology could ever erase. I stood up, walked him to the door, and before he could speak again, I said softly, "We both made choices. Yours took you away, mine brought me peace, and I intend to keep it that way." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumped as he stepped outside. And when the door closed behind him, I felt no sadness, only stillness. The kind that comes when life finally gives you the ending you didn't know you were waiting for. After he left that evening, I stood by the door for a while, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the path, until the quiet of the house wrapped itself around me again like an old, familiar blanket. I walked back to the living room, sat down where he had been sitting moments before, and stared at the empty chair across from me. The flowers he brought were still on the table, their petals trembling slightly in the breeze from the open window, and I couldn't help but think how fitting they were. Beautiful for a moment, but destined to wither, just like what we once had. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Because the moment I heard that door close, I knew that I had truly been set free. For years I thought healing would come from hearing him say he was sorry. But now I understood that healing had already come from living a life that no longer needed his words. I looked around the room and saw not the emptiness of what was lost, but the fullness of what had been built in its place. Every book on the shelf, every photograph, every letter from those I had helped. Each one proof that my life had not ended when he walked away. It had only begun. I sat there thinking about how strange it is that life brings people back, not for us to reopen old wounds, but to see how far we've come since we were broken. He had once left me standing in pieces, and now he returned only to find a woman whole, steady, and unshaken. I whispered a quiet prayer, not for him to come back, but for him to find peace in his own heart, because carrying hatred is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to fall. That night I slept deeply, without dreams, without tears, just a calmness that felt like grace itself. When I woke up the next morning, the light coming through the curtains was soft and kind, and I smiled, knowing that I didn't need closure from him, because life had already given it to me in the form of peace. And peace, once found, is a home no one can take away. In the days that followed, the quiet of my home felt different. Softer somehow. Not like loneliness, but like a gentle reminder that I had earned every bit of calm that surrounded me. I went about my routines the same as always. Watering the garden, visiting the center, reading in the evenings, yet everything felt lighter, as if the air itself had been cleansed of something heavy I didn't know I was still carrying. I often thought back to that night when he sat across from me, broken and full of regret, and I realized how much strength it had taken not to let anger speak for me. Because forgiveness, I learned, isn't a gift we give to those who hurt us. It's a gift we give ourselves to finally breathe again. I began to see my life not through the lens of what I lost, but through the blessings that had quietly found their way to me. The laughter of those I mentored, the letters that still came from faraway places, and the peace that met me every morning when I opened my curtains to the light. One afternoon I found an old photograph tucked inside a book. It was of me and him on our wedding day, smiling like the world was ours, and instead of pain, I felt a strange tenderness, not for what we became, but for who we were before life changed us. I placed that picture back between the pages and whispered, "Thank you. Not for leaving, but for teaching me that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stays silent and carries on." The phone still rings now and then, his number flashing again and again, but I don't rush to answer. I just let it echo for a moment before it fades away. Because I've come to understand that not every story needs a conversation to end. Some simply close themselves with time and truth. And as the sun sets each evening, casting golden light across my little home, I sit back with a cup of tea and smile, knowing that everything I thought I needed to hear, I have already told myself. And that is enough. Sometimes I still think about how different my life might have been if things had gone the way I once dreamed. But then I look around me now and realize that every broken piece, every tear, and every quiet night alone brought me right here to this peace I now call mine. I learned that love is not proven by who stays, but by who you become after someone leaves. I am no longer the woman waiting by the window, nor the one begging life to be fair. I am simply Helen. A woman who found her worth not through someone else's eyes, but through her own reflection. The past doesn't hurt the way it used to. It simply whispers lessons I will never forget. And even when the phone lights up again, I just smile, because there's nothing left to answer, nothing left to fix. Only gratitude for the life that grew from the silence. I want to thank you, truly, for staying with me till the end of my story. Your time means more than you know, and if it touched your heart, please tell me where you're watching from. I always love hearing from you. Don't forget to subscribe and join me again next time, because every story, even the painful ones, can lead us somewhere beautiful when told with a little truth and a lot of heart.